Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Tariffs are here, and many vendor teams may already be busier than ever with how the tariffs have caused changes in the vendor process. There may be additional validations involved in 4 areas. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 354. Tariffs may affect your vendor validations. And you know what? Maybe you have already seen that. But in case you haven't, or in case you haven't looked at these 4 different vendor validation areas where you may need to add or broaden to your vendor validations, that is what we are talking about today. So before I get into the 4 areas of validations, I do want to talk about what are tariffs and how they impact the vendor process. So first of all, tariffs are taxes imposed by governments on imported goods, often to protect domestic industries or respond to trade disputes. Now, some importers will initially pay these taxes at customs, but really the financial burden is ultimately borne by, the businesses and consumers through higher costs. And so your company may have already experienced the fact that you have some vendors that are in these tariff-affected countries, and those vendors are increasing their costs or the prices for those goods, and maybe even services as well. If some of those service providers, rely on goods, that again are affected by these tariffs. So really, any rise in costs from your existing vendors may result in changing who your company does business with, really kind of leading to a new vendor. And also, it can affect your existing vendors too, causing more changes or causing changes if your existing vendor decides that they want to relocate to a non-tariff or lower tariff country. So really, it can affect your vendor process by increased activity with your company switching vendors. So you're adding a new vendor, and maybe with your vendor relocating. And so now you've got to update, their address information and perhaps their banking as well. So we all know that that's where the fraud can come in. And we also know that the fraudsters know that all of this is happening. They know that you are creating new vendors. they know that you are maybe updating existing vendors. And so, yes, they're going to take advantage of that. They're going to try to get set up in your vendor master file as a new vendor. They're going to try to pretend that they are your existing vendor that is relocating or changing their banking information. And so that can lead to more fraud. So let's just talk about then the vendor validations may be affected because these things are happening. And the reason that I say that it's a big effect on vendor validations is because when we talk about U.S. companies that are doing business with these tariffed countries, that means they're a non-US vendor. And maybe your new vendor that, is not going to be impacted by tariffs or as much is in a country that, you have not done validations for in the past. Maybe it's a completely new country that you now have to validate your vendors from. All right, so let's get started looking at these vendor validations in non-US countries and how that's kind of different, right? Can differ from the US validations or the validations that you do for your US vendors. And also, right, some of these countries can have unique requirements that is different from other non US countries. So there are 4 areas where I'm going to talk about this. And where I am taking this from is I am taking this from the template that I use when I do custom vendor validations for my clients. Now, that is a paid service. I am going to put a link to that page so you can take a look at what I do and see if that's something that you would like. And by the way, if you're a Vendor Process Training Pass member, you actually have that included in the Training Pass fee. So don't forget to schedule that. All right, so the vendor validations, 4 areas. The first one is the registration numbers. And we all know that it's not just about the IRS tax ID. Other countries have vendor registration numbers that they can give you. And I recommend that you always collect one, even if they don't have a US tax ID, because it can be used, one, as a unique identifier in your vendor master file, so you can make sure that you don't have duplicates, and right, it's one more level of deterrence from fraudsters that, if you don't require anything, then it's that much easier for them to get set up in your vendor master file. Not to mention the fact that, a lot of countries have registration numbers that either you can validate via the format if they don't have a formal validation for that number, or that have a resource where you can validate that number. A great example is the value added tax, or VAT, that are in a lot of countries. You can use that as a unique identifier, and you can also verify that it is a valid number. Now, I do have a file called the Global Vendor Registration Numbers list that has the global vendor registration numbers for over 120 countries out there. Again, a lot of these countries have global or have registration numbers for their vendors, be it a sales tax number or an individual number or a business number. They're out there. And so in addition, or in place of an IRS tax ID, you might have a country like, let's just say, Canada, that has, right, a business number that you can collect from the vendor that is an entity, or that has a social insurance number if your vendor is an an individual. Or let's pick something like, I don't know, Spain. Now, Spain has a VAT number. They also have what they call a tax identification number. And they also have, right, a national identity card, and that might be, you might hear it called DNI or NIF. Now, you can only validate the actual format because there is no place that you could go, at least not that I can find, that you can validate that the number is valid. But for all of these, I have a format, I have how long they are. This one happens to be 9 digits. If you go someplace like Singapore, they have an income tax reference number for individuals that's 10 digits long. If it is for a business in Singapore, they have an income tax reference number, and that is also, right, 10 digits long. So they have both an individual income tax reference number and a business income tax reference number. Neither one of which, right, you can validate via resource, but you can validate the format. Now, I didn't mention Canada's business number. There is a validation resource that is available. And the United Kingdom is another good one. And that one has a value added tax number, so a VAT number, and that has a place that you can or resource to validate it. And looking at this list, even those countries that don't have somewhere to validate their vendor registration numbers, a lot of them also have value added tax number or VAT number. And that can be something that you can collect, in addition to, a business number or a registration number for an individual or for a business. You can collect both numbers. So at least you'll have something to validate for that vendor. Again, to make sure, that they are a valid vendor and not a fraudster. Plus, VAT numbers can be very good for the vendor team to store. It's not something necessarily that we use, but it can be very useful for those folks in your company that have to file reports to reclaim the VAT that was paid on invoices. Now, I've just given you some examples of global registration numbers by, a few countries. And again, the global vendor registration numbers file that I have, right, by country is available to my Training Pass members, or you can purchase it separately. And I'll leave a link to where you can purchase it separately. But in case you're not able to purchase it, or you're not a vendor process training pass member, you can, I mean, you can still get these the validations. You can look them up, do a Google search, go into ChatGPT or whatever AI tool you're using, and see if you can find it that way. The point is you need to identify whatever registration number is used by the country that your vendor is in, so that you can, one, use it as a unique identifier in your accounting system or ERP to avoid duplicates, and also to avoid fraud, making sure that that vendor is real. Now, the second area of vendor validations is addresses. Now, we all know how to validate U.S. addresses. You can go to the IRS, it's free. You can do their zip code lookup search and put the address in, and it will, validate it, format it, standardize it so that, whatever you send your vendor will actually get there. Now, it's a little bit more complicated with non-US addresses. Now, yes, the US Postal Service, USPS, does offer, and I think it's under Publication 28. Don't remember off the top of my head. Oh, yeah, it is Publication 28. And that is where it will have some labels for certain countries that will apply to all countries. And so I think they have three different labels. One is for Germany, and I think that's the one that is supposed to apply to all countries. But they also have one for Canada, and then I forget what the third one is. But in any event, that's how it handles non US addresses. It does not have like a lookup tool for that, at least not that I have ever found. And so, what I usually recommend is that if you are sending from a US address to a non US address, that you use the United States Postal Service. Now, if you're in a non US address and you're sending to a non US based address, I do recommend that you use a universal postal union, which I kind of like theirs, but it's not as it just takes a little bit more time. Like I have a link right where, and maybe I'll just post these in the show notes along with the global vendor registration numbers where you can just click the link, go to their page, and I think halfway down is the address validations, but you identify what country you want to send it to, and then what will pop up is a PDF, and that PDF is anywhere from 1 to 3 pages, and it'll actually break down the address for that country. Probably gives you like TMI, too much information. All you really want to see is the format, but it gives you that, and it kind of gives you explanation for it as well. And so you might want to do that if you've got, branches in other countries and maybe you want to send it from that branch, or maybe you just want to send it from the US because it should really be the same format and it's a little more detailed, or it gives you a little more customized. Not a little more, it is more customized because it's just for that country, not a label for, Germany and expect you to convert that to whatever, address or whatever country you're sending it to. And so, you can try either one of those. They're both free. Do recommend though, if you have some funds, is to take a look at a company called Smarty. And Smarty, if you ever look at some of these websites where you go to put your address in, and when you start typing it, it automatically populates like the whole address. Some of those companies have worked with or are working with Smarty to provide that information, and it actually works out really well because we may fat finger it. We may not put in the address +4 or zip code +4, and so it does it on our behalf, and we don't have to type as much. You can use that resource for your own validation. Now, it does cost. They're always kind of changing the tiers, but like 50, looking up 50 non-US addresses, I think at one point was like $7, right? And you get that much in a month, and you can renew or cancel your subscription anytime. What I really like it for though is one, it is connected to USPS. I think it's also connected to the Universal Postal Union, but I could be wrong about that. But it does both US and non-US addresses. It will format it correctly for you. It'll populate anything that you might be missing. But the best thing about it is that you can not only do a one by one lookup tool, but if you're cleaning your vendor master file, you can do a bulk upload, and it will do the same thing in like 20 seconds if it took that long. But again, it is a paid service. So I know they give you a free tier, but international is never included in that tier. But in any event, you can check them out too. Again, it is the paid service. All right. So vendor validation registration numbers was number one. Vendor validation addresses was number two. The third one is the vendor validations for bank data. Because if you were, dealing with just the US, then all you really cared about was the routing number. And right there's validation, free validations for that. And hopefully you are doing it. And the routing number can be very important. And, it's the routing number, it's really the bank branch identifier, but that can be very important because banks merge and, as we saw a few years back, they can fail and just close altogether. And any of that activity, failing, merging, getting acquired, changes their bank branch number. And so you really should be checking those when you're onboarding your vendors because the vendors will always pay attention to that, especially if their bank account number doesn't change, which a lot of times it doesn't, just to make it easier. And so you should be checking those because if you send a file to the bank to make your electronic payments, either ACH or wire, and it includes one of those old routing numbers, then they may or may not change it for you, and it may, right, result in an unsuccessful payment. So you do want to make sure you are checking the bank data. And so when I talk about that, I want to talk about the countries that, require non-US countries, and they can either require an IBAN, excuse me, or a BIC code, like a SWIFT code. And so some countries require one, some countries require another. Some countries have some uh, different banking requirements, like some LATAM countries, right, may require some additional like barcodes. So you need to know what those are. And with the bank branch identifiers, right? There are some resources to validate the bit code and the IBAN. And Swift.com really does both. So you can type in your IBAN and you can validate it. Also, it has a PDF for IBANs, the formats based on country, so you can download that. Also, if you're doing something for Canada, if you have vendors that are in Canada and you haven't done any validations for Canadian vendors in the past, they have for the bank branch numbers, they have routing numbers too, but they don't really have a lookup. They really have a what do you call that? A site where you can go and download the applicable PDF because they have it separated based on the type of financial institution. But you can download those PDFs and then validate, right, the routing number. Now, they do claim that they update the PDFs on a weekly basis. So make sure that you're always downloading and validating against the latest PDF. So that's just an example, right, of what you have to do for your bank branch data. Now, if you have bank account ownership ability, and maybe now you're doing it for different countries, a lot of the providers, third-party providers that provide that service, will identify the specific countries that they're in or that they validate for. So you want to make sure that, as you're adding these countries that you haven't had before, that you're checking with these third party providers to make sure that the countries that you're adding are also countries that they provide bank account ownership validation for. All right, so that was the third one, vendor validations for bank data. We also went over vendor validations for registration numbers and also vendor validations for addresses. Now, the fourth one is vendor validations for watch lists. Now, I know that as a U.S. entity that you know that you have to check the OFAC watch list because U.S. entities and individuals are prohibited from paying vendors that appear on these lists. And so you still need to do that, but just know this, if you hadn't already, even if you did have US or non-US vendors, is that if you are making payments to non-US financial institutions, right? Because non-US vendors come with non-US financial institutions, then you also need to check the non-US financial institution name against the OFAC list, because OFAC really is a consolidated list of watch lists or sanctions lists. And one of those lists is called, the acronym is the CAPTA list. And it's something about, I forget the actual name of it, but it's foreign financial institutions. And those are the foreign financial institutions that you should not be sending payments to. So make sure that you're always checking your foreign non-U.S. vendors, foreign financial institutions against the OFAC list. Now, another thing too is that some of these company or countries have their own sanctions list for their vendors. Now, whether or not your company is required to abide by those lists, like if the vendors show up, whether you can or cannot do business with them, that's something you probably want to check with your risk team. But there are some countries, right, that have their own watch list. One is the EU sanctions list. And so this is the European Union External Action Service, and it really has persons or so people, groups, and entities that are subject to EU financial sanctions. Again, whether that applies to your company or not, that's something that I would check with your legal or risk team. UK also has one. So the United Kingdom has the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, or OFSI, and it's really part of the HM Treasury. It enables financial sanctions to make the fullest possible contribution to the UK's foreign policy and national security goals. It also helps to maintain the integrity and confidence in the UK financial services section. And there may be more sanctions lists in other countries as well. So, what I recommend, and that is with all of these areas, so vendor validation, registration numbers, addresses, bank data, watch lists. If you have countries that are new to your vendor validations, then do some research on those countries and see what resources are available for validations. See if you can identify which ones are required, and check with your leadership, check with your risk management team, check with your legal team to make sure that you are performing all of the vendor validations that are required for these countries that you're either doing business in now or that are new and you're doing business with them, right, as a result of tariffs or, any other reason. You really need to make sure that you know what countries your vendors are in and you are performing the right validations. And again, if you would like to have a paid service, which is the customized vendor validation session with me, I will put a link to that in the show notes. And I did talk about some validations here that I'll put in the show notes as well. And I think that is it for today. And, I just want to say too that for whatever reason, the tariffs are gone on, whether you agree with them or not, they do have an effect on the vendor process. And so that, job security is the way I look at it, but you do need to be prepared for that. All right, so that is it for today. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 354th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.